Hello and welcome to this lecture on political geography. My name is Dr. Gerard Toal. I'm a professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech in Washington metro area. And this lecture deals with a book that I have assigned for this module, which is Tarik, Cyril, Amar's book, The Paradox of Ukrainian Lviv, a borderland city between Stalinists, Nazis, and nationalists. Now, this book deals with the processes of placemaking. It's a violent making of what is now a national heartland. And it's a process which saw the erasure of a multi-ethnic provincial metropole. The Ukrainian Lviv, as it is known as today, was previously Polish Lwow, and it was previously Habsburg Lemberg, and it was also known as Lvov by the Russians. There's been considerable population change in it. So this is a table which deals with the population makeup by ethnicity of Ukrainian Lviv. So in 1900, the Ukrainian population was only about 20% of the population. It was just about a majority Polish city in the first half of the 20th century. As you can see, in 1931, 50.4% of the population is Polish. A third of the population is Jewish, and then you have a small Ukrainian population, but that increases quite significantly. By 1944, at the end of the war, they are a quarter of the population. By 1950, half of the population. You have an influx of Russians, and then today it is about 90% Ukrainian. Now, it's that particular change of population that we have to consider in this particular lecture. Now, Amar sets up the book as a paradox. It's a paradox of Ukrainian Lviv. And he defines that paradox in the introduction. He describes it as a double paradox. So, thus, the modern foundation of today's Lviv, geographically on the margins, but central to Ukraine's identity, politics and culture of memory. It encapsulates a double and recent paradox. The city was molded into a modern national centre by two highly authoritarian and massively violent regimes, Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union, which usually defined each other as abhorrent opposites. Most of this transformation, moreover, occurred under Soviet rule, when the Soviet Union was fighting Ukrainian nationalism as an absolute evil. So that's the paradox of Ukrainian Lviv. It is a story of occupation, of genocide, of deportations, and of migrations. And so I've tried to represent this here. There's a very eventful processes that occur from September 1939 to 1941, where you have the first Soviet occupation, then the German occupation, and the genocide against the Jewish population in the city and the surrounding area, then the Soviet reoccupation and the deportation of the Polish population of the city, and then the move towards Ukrainianization in a Soviet way in the post-war period, with a considerable migration from eastern Ukraine and from Russia to the city. And then you have the emergence of an independent Ukraine in December of 1991. Now, what you have operating on the city are competing fantasies for the remaking of the territory and of its population. So this is political geography in a very violent idiom. You have the imposition of Soviet modernization fantasies, followed by German racial fantasies, and all the while you have competing Polish national fantasies about it being part of an integral Poland, and then you have Ukrainian nationalist fantasies to have the city as a center for the Ukrainian nation. All of these are competing to try to reconstitute, to dominate the city and reconstitute it. So the first that he examines is the Soviet occupation in 1939 to 1941, when Lwów became Lvov and became Lviv in a Soviet sense. And he discusses that in terms of a civilizational mission that the Soviet Union brought to this area. Even though it was in the West, it was considered to be a less developed area than the East, than the Donbass, and then Moscow and elsewhere. So let's talk a little bit about the Soviet fantasy for the remaking of the city of Lwów. The Soviet Union saw itself as the vanguard of new modernity, a modernity of collective living, centralized planning, and the creation of Soviet identities which transcended parochial national identities. So to the extent that they had a hierarchy beyond the classic set of divisions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, their hierarchy of modernity had a Soviet vanguard at the very top. And this was Soviet man was something that all citizens were to aspire to be. It was someone who was fully committed to transformation and modernization of society. Below that were titular nations. There was nations that were recognized as being part of the Soviet Union, but they were to subordinate their nationalism to the Soviet communist project. And then below that was a sort of negative nationalism, a fascist nationalism, because the communists tended to lump all forms of nationalism which were anti-communist into the big category of fascist. And those were the enemies of Soviet transformation, the enemies of the proletariat, the enemies of the state, and they were to be dealt with ruthlessly. So the goal of Soviet modernization was to institute titular nations and to sort of lift them up to Soviet consciousness. That was the theory. Of course, the practice was that the Soviet Union was a police state that regularly terrorized its citizens and promoted policies which were extremely brutal and induced famine. Finally, there's one qualification that I need to make about this particular slide. Here I'm describing Soviet hierarchy writ large. You need to bear in mind that during the first occupation, this concern with fascist nationalism was silent. There, the Nazis were the allies, in effect, of the Soviet Union. It was only after the invasion, Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis, that the Nazis went from being allies to being enemies and deadly enemies of the Soviet Union. So during the first period, while there was concern with nationalism, they didn't use the category fascist nationalism in the way it later became used. And in part, this tells us something about the Soviet Union and the ways in which, for convenient purposes, the Stalin was able to turn on and turn off certain ideological conceptions and worldviews and categories. So these categories came and went dependent upon the needs of the ruling communist elite. Now let's talk about the Nazi transformation of the city. And he has a chapter on this. It's an extremely disturbing, sad story about ghettoization and pogroms against the Jewish population of Lemberg, which was 1/3 of the population, as you know. The operational Nazi racial hierarchy had Aryans at the top, the Germans, then Slavs as below them, significantly below them, and Poles, Ukrainians and Russians were all part of the Slavic categorization. But even below the Slavs were the Jews, and Jews were associated with exploitation, arch capitalism, but also with Bolshevism, and this kind of compound that they created. This Judeo-Bolshevism was a frame in which it allowed the Nazis to commit genocide against this population by, in their particular worldview, by killing them, because that was sort of purifying the nation, while you enslaved the Slavs so that Lebensraum would be created, and the population of Germany, the expanding population of Germany, would be fed and served by the Slavs. Now, operating also were clashing Ukrainian nationalist visions, and he outlines the two dominant ones: the Western Ukrainian one, which tended to be Galician, authoritarian, and did cooperate with Nazi Germany on occasion, although they also fought against Nazi Germany. And then you have an Eastern Ukrainian nationalism, which tended to be, as he calls it, Creole. It was much more mixed. It was shaped by Stalinism, and it had a subordination to Russia as its fraternal big brother. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture that it's important to also pay attention to local actors and what they do in their particular agency. So while the Wehrmacht was fighting against the Red Army, you also had a series of other militias that were national in organization. You had the resistance on the part of the Polish Home Army to Nazi occupation, but also to the coming Soviet occupation. And then you had Ukrainian nationalist forces too. We also need to remember that they fought each other. There is a series of different militias here that we need to bear in mind. But one thing, and the degree to which they kind of collaborated with the Nazis and the communists varied from time to time. But it's important to understand that part of the contested and bitter historical memory of this period is the fact that there was a series of massacres undertaken by the Ukrainian insurgent army against Polish civilians and citizens in areas of modern day Ukraine. So this is the Wikipedia page which deals with that, the massacres of Poles in these areas. And they began in March 1943 and they lasted until the end of 1944. The peak of the massacres took place in July and August of 1943. So that's a bitter memory that still shapes Ukrainian-Polish relations to this day. Now, in 1944, all of these particular forces sought to control Lviv, Lwow. The Germans were in retreat and abandoning the city. The Polish Home Army engaged in an uprising from July 23rd to July 27th in 1944 in order to take the city ahead of the Red Army, because they feared that the Red Army would occupy it again, and that Lwow, which was still predominantly Polish at this time, the Jewish population had been eliminated, so it was even more significantly Polish, although the population had decreased, but proportionately it was more strongly Polish. They feared that they would lose the city, and of course, indeed, that is exactly what happened. So the Red Army came into the city towards the end of 1944, and they eventually disarmed and crushed the Polish forces, and they imposed their power. And of course, the Soviet Empire was created in Eastern Europe, and it included not simply Ukraine but also Poland as well. And the particular order of government that was created by the Soviet Union was one that involved Sovietization, industrialization, and Ukrainianization in a Soviet accent. So this was not a support of Ukrainian nationalism as the UPA or the Ukrainian nationalist forces would have wanted. This was a subordinate form of Ukrainian nationalism, an Eastern form, which was very much subordinate to the Soviet Union, in particular to Russia. Now, Amar outlines how Sovietization was a civilizational mission, and here are some of the different characteristics as he outlines them of this civilizing mission. So there was a sort of colonial encounter of sorts in which you had the self-constituted, advanced, modernizing Soviet citizens encountering locals who are considered to be backward, primitive, prone to superstition, religiosity, and also to nationalism, fascist nationalism. And so that is part of how we need to understand what was occurring after the end of the Second World War. There was a sort of imperial quality to the recreation of Lwow as Lviv, but it was one that had particular characteristics that we need to take seriously. Now, obviously, this lecture is no substitute for reading the book itself. In reading it, what I would like you to pay attention to is particularly the theme of biopolitics, which I've already flagged as significant. Not simply the territorialization dimensions, the making of space, but also the making of peoples, and the shaping of and controlling of and policing of peoples. Now, in interwar Poland, the process of making the city was a conscious effort to try to Polonize it, to make it Polish, to name the city streets after Polish heroes, to have Polish dominate the educational institutions and the life of the city. And then that stopped with the Soviet occupation. You have the new institutions of government and control, and you have a form of terror created. And it's worth underscoring the ways in which this terror shaped a public persona on the part of the population in order to conform publicly, whereas in private they may have had very different attitudes and dispositions. And of course it was arbitrary and capricious, and so he discusses a number of denunciations and intra-elite struggles that are part of that. Pay attention to the process of passportization, the ways in which identity papers are very, very important here in this process. Then with the German occupation, you have the reconstitution of the city as Lemberg. It is no longer Western Ukraine. It's part of District Galician. It's part of the general government. This sort of entity which is dominated by Hans Frank, the governor, and ruthlessly exploited. You have the SS roaming the streets and terrorizing the population, particularly the Jewish population. You have collaborationist militias who are operating, and you have particular special courts judging the population, controlling it, making decisions of life and death for the population. Then you have the return of the Soviets, the Red Army and the NKVD. You have the imposition of the Soviet structures of power and of the terror that came along with that, as well as the tremendous waste and the counterinsurgency against the Ukrainian nationalist forces in the countryside. You had the attempt to try to eliminate the backward Ukrainian nationalist Ukrainian population in the countryside, as well as an attempt to sort of lift them up and make them into good Soviet citizens. Pay attention to the ways in which he discusses the process of collectivization, the trade schools, and the Komsomol as a particular agency for advancement, as well as you can see, the sort of the dysfunctionality of it. It's quite astounding that there was a famine after World War II, just like there was a famine in the interwar period in Ukraine and also parts of Russia. This was a Soviet modernity which was civilizational in its aspirations, but which was also very, very brutal in its practices, everyday practices. So overall, this book is an extremely interesting case study of a city which was radically remade in the 20th century. It's a city which was in the center of the Bloodlands, which has a kind of terrible, terrible history, but is now overwhelmingly Ukrainian city that which is associated with the Ukrainian national movement. And the irony of that is that today the Ukrainian national forces are arrayed against Russia, and Russia is celebrating or sees itself as the carrier of the legacy of the Soviet Union. Yet it was Soviet modernity that made Lviv Ukrainian. So you have not simply a paradox, you have this kind of irony, bitter irony to some, sharp irony, and then you have also the ghosts of the past, the Jewish population that was eliminated, that is not there because of the ways in which the Bloodlands were a site of genocide against the Jewish people. Okay, so this is a very, very interesting book, a very challenging book, and I hope that you enjoy it and are able to write a very good assignment on the basis of it. Okay, thank you for listening, and we'll move on to the next module now.